The car door slammed shut, and he turned around, probably expecting a casual glance back at me as he strutted off. Instead, he froze, eyes wide with shock as something blinding hit him like a freight train. The air was split with a sickening thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath, and then everything went black for him. I watched, my breath steady, as his body crumpled to the ground. The alley, usually dead silent at this hour, echoed with his pain for just a moment, before silence swallowed it again. They found him not long after, slumped over, unconscious, blood pooling beneath him. The paramedics did their best to stabilize him on the spot, but the damage was already done. I heard later from the detectives that both his arms and legs were broken, his face swollen and distorted from the blows. But that wasn't the worst of it. His crotch, the source of his manly pride, was obliterated beyond repair. They had to remove both testicles, an irreversible act of emasculation. The thought lingered in my mind, a cold satisfaction mingling with the bitter taste of what had led us all to this point. I was questioned, of course, brought in like everyone else who might have had a reason to see him suffer. But I had an alibi, a rock-solid one. The detectives asked the same questions, circled the same doubts, but I recited my story, down to every detail, without faltering. I had timed everything perfectly, and not a single thing could tie me to what had happened to him that night. They eventually let me go, reluctantly, leaving me to return to the life I had carefully kept from unraveling. But as I walked out of that station, I knew something had shifted irreversibly. The wheels were in motion, and nothing would be the same again. Tracy's voice echoed in my mind, her soft confessions, the cruel words of her betrayal, and my resolve hardened with every step I took. For now, I was a free man. But this story was far from over. I could still hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead as I sat in the dim living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside my head. Tracy hadn't come home yet. I knew where she was, where she always was these days, and the thought twisted my gut in ways that I couldn't put into words. It was almost midnight when the front door creaked open. I didn't look up. I just listened to the soft click of her heels as she made her way inside, the quiet rustle of her coat being hung up, the faint clink of keys being tossed onto the kitchen counter. It was all so ordinary, so painfully routine, like nothing had changed. But everything had. I knew, and she knew, that I knew. Blake? Her voice was tentative, almost questioning, as if she was testing the waters, trying to gauge where I stood. I didn't answer right away, taking another slow sip of the whiskey instead. The burn was familiar, a distraction, but it wasn't enough to drown out the thoughts clawing at the edges of my mind. She walked into the living room, standing in the doorway as if unsure whether to come closer. I could feel her eyes on me, but I still didn't look up. "Blake, are you okay?" That question. It was loaded, pregnant with so many unspoken truths that it made my skin crawl. I set the glass down on the table, finally lifting my gaze to meet hers. "Where were you?" The room seemed to hold its breath as the question hung in the air. She shifted uncomfortably, and I saw the lie forming on her lips before she even spoke. "I was out with Sarah. Don't," I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't lie to me, Tracy." Her eyes widened, and for a split second I saw fear flash across her face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that practiced calm, the same facade she had been wearing for weeks now. She walked over to the couch, sitting down beside me, though she kept a careful distance. "I don't know what you're talking about, Blake," she said softly, but there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed her. I laughed, a short, humorless sound that tasted bitter in my mouth. "You're really going to sit there and play dumb? After everything?" She didn't answer, and the silence between us grew thicker, more oppressive. I could feel the anger rising inside me, a slow, steady boil that I had been trying so hard to keep in check. But now, with her sitting here, lying to my face, it was all I could do to keep from exploding. "I know, Tracy," I said quietly, the words heavy with the weight of the truth they carried. "I know about you and him." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the burden of it. But she still didn't say anything, didn't offer an apology or an excuse. Maybe she knew it wouldn't make a difference. "7 months, I continued, my voice hardening as I spoke. 7 months you've been sneaking around behind my back, and for what? What the hell were you thinking, Tracy?" She flinched at the accusation, but she didn't deny it. "Blake, Save it," I snapped, cutting her off again. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I want to know why." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to happen like this. I felt so alone, Blake. You were always so distant, so focused on your work, and You're blaming me for this?" The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted, and I stood up, pacing the room in a futile attempt to calm myself. "I worked my ass off for this family, for you, and this is how you repay me? By spreading your legs for another man?" The words were cruel, harsher than I intended, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the pain that had been gnawing at me ever since I found out. I wanted her to hurt as much as I did. She didn't respond right away, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Blake. I was lost." I stopped pacing, turning to face her. "Lost? You didn't look lost when you were sneaking out at night to be with him. You didn't look lost when you were lying to my face every day. You knew exactly what you were doing." She broke down then, sobbing quietly into her hands. But there was no satisfaction in seeing her cry, no relief in watching her fall apart. If anything, it made the hollow ache in my chest grow even more pronounced. I stood there, watching her, feeling a strange mix of anger, betrayal, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that once you took that step, there was no going back. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to fall. Tracy's sobs filled the room, each one slicing through the air like a jagged blade. I watched her, feeling that pit of anger and sadness deepen, but there was something else too, a twisted sense of relief. Finally, after months of suspecting, of piecing together fragments of her deceit, it was all out in the open. There were no more lies to hide behind, no more masks to wear. The truth had been laid bare between us, raw and ugly. But what now? What the hell was I supposed to do with this? I walked over to the window, looking out into the dark, empty street. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that should bring peace, but instead felt suffocating. I heard Tracy's muffled cries behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and comfort her. I wasn't sure I even had the capacity to feel sympathy for her anymore, not after what she had done. "You're going to tell me everything," I said, my voice cold, detached. "And I mean everything, Tracy. I want to know how it started, how long it's been going on, and why." There was a long pause before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was thick with emotion. It started a little over 7 months ago. I was working late. You remember that night?" I did remember. It was one of those nights where I had come home to an empty house, assuming she was just caught up at work. I hadn't thought much of it then, just another late night in a string of many. But now, knowing what I did, it made me sick to think about what had really been happening. "Stan, Mr. Cross, he was there too," she continued, her voice trembling. "We had been working closely on this big project. One thing led to another, and I don't know, Blake. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. So, it was just sex? That's all? She hesitated, and that hesitation spoke volumes. At first, yes, but then it became more. We started meeting up outside of work, spending more time together. He made me feel wanted, Blake, like I was the center of his world. I could barely contain the disgust bubbling up inside me. So what? I wasn't enough for you? All those years we spent together, everything we built, and you just threw it away for a cheap thrill? It wasn't like that, she cried, her voice breaking again. You don't understand, Blake. I didn't want to hurt you, but I felt so disconnected from you, from us. And he filled that void. That's bullshit, Tracy, I spat, turning to face her, the rage flaring hot inside me. You had a choice. You could have talked to me, told me how you felt, but instead you went behind my back and slept with another man. You destroyed everything we had. Her tears kept falling, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All I could see was the image of her with him, the man who had taken everything from me. My fists clenched tighter, and I had to remind myself to breathe, to not let the anger consume me entirely. I'm sorry, Blake, she whispered, her voice so small, so pathetic. I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't want to lose you. But you did, Tracy, I said, my voice like ice. You lost me the moment you let him touch you. There's no coming back from that. She sobbed harder, and I just stood there, feeling nothing but emptiness. The marriage we had built, the life we had shared, it all seemed so meaningless now, reduced to ashes because of one selfish, reckless decision on her part. Finally, I forced myself to speak again, the words heavy with finality. I want you to pack your things and leave, Tracy. Go stay with him if that's what you want. But you're not staying here. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face full of desperation. Blake, please don't do this. We can work through this. We can— No, I interrupted, my tone resolute. There's nothing to work through. It's over. I saw the moment she realized there was no changing my mind, the moment her last hope crumbled. She stood up slowly, wiping her face with trembling hands. Where will I go? I don't care, I replied, the coldness in my voice a stark contrast to the raging storm inside me. Just go. She hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for me to take it back, to say something, anything that might give her a sliver of hope. But I said nothing, and eventually, she turned and walked out of the room. I listened as she made her way upstairs, the sounds of drawers opening and closing, of suitcases being dragged across the floor. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart, not my own. When she came back down, carrying her bags, she paused at the door. I'll call you, she said quietly, but I didn't respond. She left then, the door clicking shut behind her, and with it, the silence descended once more. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space she had occupied just moments before, trying to process what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The pain was too fresh, the wound too deep. Eventually, I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of everything crushing down on me. The whiskey sat untouched on the table, and I stared at it, wondering if anything could dull the ache in my chest. But I knew it wouldn't. This wasn't something I could drink away. This was a betrayal that had cut too deep, and there was no escaping the agony that came with it. The hours bled into one another as I sat there, the house wrapped in an oppressive stillness that pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. Tracy was gone, really gone this time, and the emptiness she left behind seemed to echo in every corner of the room. I had spent so many nights wondering what I would feel when this moment came, but nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache that gnawed at my insides. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. the exhaustion finally overtaking the turmoil inside me. But when I woke up, it wasn't to the usual comfort of my bed. The couch was stiff beneath me, and the faint light of early morning filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. My body ached, both from the awkward position I had slept in and the emotional toll of the night before. I rubbed my face, trying to clear the fog from my mind. Everything felt surreal, as if I were floating just outside my own body, watching myself go through the motions. I could still smell her perfume lingering in the air, a reminder of what had once been and what was now irreparably broken. The first thing I did was check my phone. It was an old habit, one I couldn't shake, even after everything. But there were no messages from her, no missed calls. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed. Part of me expected her to try and reach out, to say something, anything to mend what she had shattered. But I knew it was futile. Words wouldn't fix this. Nothing could. I stood up, stretching out the stiffness in my limbs, and made my way to the kitchen. The coffee machine whirred to life, and as I stood there waiting, the events of the previous night replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Every detail, every word exchanged, etched into my memory with painful clarity. And no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, the images kept coming back. Tracy's tear-streaked face, the hollow sound of the door closing behind her, the emptiness that followed. The coffee didn't help. It was just another thing to fill the void, a distraction that did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. I needed to get out of the house, away from the memories that clung to every surface like a thick, suffocating fog. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and I needed to breathe, really breathe, for the first time in what felt like days. Grabbing my keys, I headed out the door, not really sure where I was going. I just drove, letting the road take me wherever it wanted. The streets were quiet, the early morning sun casting a golden hue over everything. It should have been peaceful, but all I could think about was how different my life had been just 24 hours ago, how everything had changed in an instant. I ended up at the park, an old familiar place where I used to go when I needed to clear my head. It was early enough that the place was mostly deserted, save for a few joggers and an elderly couple walking their dog. I found a bench near the lake and sat down, staring out at the water, trying to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling inside me. How had it come to this? How had I let things get so far out of control? I'd been so wrapped up in work, in providing for our family, that I hadn't even noticed the cracks forming beneath the surface. Or maybe I had, but I just didn't want to see them. It was easier to focus on the things I could control, to bury myself in work and pretend that everything was fine. But it hadn't been fine. Tracy had been slipping away from me, and I had been too blind, too distracted to notice. And now it was too late. She was gone, and there was no going back, no fixing what was broken. I sat there for hours, the weight of it all pressing down on me, until the sun was high in the sky and the park started to fill with people. Families, couples, kids playing. Things that used to bring me joy, now just felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and leave. I couldn't sit there all day, wallowing in self-pity. I had to face the reality of what had happened, even if it felt like it was going to crush me. The drive back home was a blur, the streets passing by in a haze of colors and noise. When I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before me like a monument to my failure. I sat there for a moment staring at it, wondering how I was going to walk back inside and face the emptiness that awaited me. But I didn't have a choice. I had to go on, somehow. So I got out of the car and walked up to the front door, each step heavier than the last. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silent house. I froze as I stepped inside. Something was off. The air felt different, heavier, like there was a presence that didn't belong. My heart started to pound, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I moved cautiously through the house, my senses on high alert, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. And then I saw it. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting on the kitchen counter. My stomach dropped as I reached for it, my hands trembling. I unfolded the note, the words scrawled in Tracy's familiar handwriting, sending a fresh wave of pain crashing over me. Blake, I'm sorry for everything. I need time to think, to figure things out. Please, just give me some space. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. Tracy. The note fell from my hands, fluttering to the ground as I stood there, numb. She was really gone. This wasn't just some temporary fight, some argument we could work through. She had left, and she wasn't coming back. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like I was falling into a void with no end in sight. The house, the life we had built together, felt like a lie. Everything I had known, everything I had taken for granted, was gone. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at that note on the floor. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. Eventually, the numbness gave way to something darker, something more primal. Anger. Rage. I grabbed the note and crumpled it in my fist, the words a cruel mockery of what we had once been. Space? Time to think? What about me? What about the life we had built, the promises we had made to each other? The anger consumed me, fueled by the betrayal, by the lies, by the realization that everything I had worked for meant nothing to her. I threw the note across the room, watching it hit the wall and fall to the floor, a useless scrap of paper. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The walls were closing in, the memories suffocating me. I needed to get out, to breathe, to escape the nightmare that my life had become. So I grabbed my coat, slammed the door behind me, and walked away, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to be anywhere but there. The cold evening air hit me like a slap as I stepped out of the house, the wind whipping through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. I walked, not really paying attention to where I was going, just needing to move, to put distance between myself and the wreckage that had once been my life. My thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and confusion, all swirling together in a chaotic storm that I couldn't escape. Every step felt like an effort, the weight of what had happened bearing down on me with every footfall. I kept walking, letting the rhythm of my steps drown out the noise in my head. The streets were empty, most people tucked away in their warm homes, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. It felt like the world had moved on, leaving me behind, stuck in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I found myself in front of a bar, its neon sign flickering in the dusk. It was one of those places I used to pass by on my way home from work, never giving it a second thought. But now, it seemed like a refuge, a place where I could drown out the pain, even if just for a little while. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the warmth and dim light enveloping me. The bar was quiet, a few scattered patrons nursing drinks, lost in their own thoughts. I made my way to the counter and slid onto a stool, nodding to the bartender as I ordered a whiskey. The glass appeared in front of me, the amber liquid catching the light as I stared into it, trying to find some semblance of peace at the bottom of the glass. But the drink didn't offer any answers, just a temporary numbness that did little to dull the ache in my chest. I downed the whiskey in one go, the burn a welcome distraction, and signaled for another. The bartender, an older man with a grizzled face, raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything as he poured me another. He'd probably seen 100 guys like me, lost, broken, trying to drown their sorrows in a bottle. As I sat there, the warmth of the alcohol spreading through my veins, the events of the past few days started to replay in my mind. Tracy's confession, the look in her eyes when I told her to leave, the note she left behind. It was all too much, too raw, And no matter how much I drank, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed. Failed as a husband, failed to see the signs, failed to keep the one person who meant the most to me. A part of me wanted to blame her entirely, to make her the villain in this story. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had my faults too, my distance, my focus on work at the expense of our relationship. Maybe if I had been more attentive, more present, things wouldn't have spiraled out of control the way they did, but it was too late for what-ifs. What was done, and there was no going back, no fixing the mess we had both created. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless, and I had to grip the edge of the bar to steady myself. Rough night? The bartender's voice cut through the fog in my mind, and I looked up to find him watching me with a knowing expression. "You could say that," I muttered, taking another sip of my drink. He nodded, wiping down the counter with a rag. "You look like you've been through hell." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "You don't know the half of it." "Want to talk about it?" he asked, leaning on the bar, his eyes never leaving mine. For a moment, I considered it. Maybe it would help, unloading on a stranger who didn't know me, didn't have any stake in my life. But then I shook my head, the words dying in my throat. What was the point? Talking about it wouldn't change anything, wouldn't bring back what I had lost. "Nah," I said finally, staring down at my drink. "It wouldn't make a difference." He didn't push, just gave me a sympathetic nod and moved on to serve another customer. I was left alone with my thoughts, the whiskey slowly loosening the knot in my chest, but not nearly enough. As the night wore on, the bar started to fill up, the quiet hum of conversation growing louder around me. I should have felt a sense of camaraderie in the crowd, a shared understanding of life's hardships, but instead, I felt more isolated than ever. Every laugh, every clink of glasses, felt like a reminder of what I had lost, of the life that had slipped through my fingers. I finished my drink and pushed the glass away, knowing that no amount of alcohol would erase the pain. It was there to stay, a constant companion, and I would have to learn to live with it. As I left the bar, the night had grown darker, the chill in the air more pronounced. I pulled my coat tighter around me, the cold seeping into my bones. My footsteps echoed in the empty streets as I made my way back home, dreading the silence that awaited me. When I finally reached the house, I hesitated at the door, the memories of Tracy and everything that had happened crashing over me like a tidal wave. I took a deep breath and forced myself to step inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me like an old friend. The house was just as I had left it, untouched, unchanged, but it felt different now, colder, emptier, like a shell of what it had once been. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps heavy, the weight of everything pressing down on me with every step. In the kitchen, the note she had left was still crumpled on the floor. I picked it up, smoothing out the creases, and stared at her words again, hoping to find some hidden meaning, some clue as to why she had done this. But there was nothing, just the same empty platitudes, the same hollow apologies. I crumpled the note again and tossed it in the trash, trying to rid myself of the last vestiges of her presence. But it wasn't that easy. Her scent, her voice, the memories of our life together, they were all still here, haunting every corner of the house. I made my way upstairs, the weight of exhaustion finally catching up to me. But when I reached the bedroom, I couldn't bring myself to go inside. The bed, the sheets, everything in there was a reminder of her, of what we had lost. Instead, I turned around and headed for the guest room, the one place in the house that didn't feel tainted by her betrayal. I collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. The whiskey had taken the edge off, but it couldn't numb the pain completely. It was still there, gnawing at me, and I knew it would be there for a long time. As I lay there, the silence pressing in on me, I realized that this was my new reality. A life without Tracy, without the woman I had loved for so long. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever truly be able to move on, or if I was destined to be haunted by this betrayal for the rest of my life. Sleep didn't offer the escape I'd hoped for. Instead, it dragged me through a series of twisted dreams, images of Tracy with him, laughing, touching, sharing the intimacy that should have been ours. I'd wake up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find myself alone in that cold, unfamiliar room. The cycle repeated throughout the night, leaving me more exhausted than I had been before I'd even laid down. When morning finally came, I felt like a hollowed-out shell. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint light through the curtains, but the warmth it should have brought was lost on me. I rolled out of bed, my body aching, and stumbled into the bathroom. The reflection staring back at me in the mirror looked like a stranger, eyes bloodshot, face pale, dark circles etched under my eyes. I was a wreck. After a cold shower that did little to shake off the fatigue, I dressed mechanically, pulling on the first clothes I could find. I didn't have the energy to care how I looked or where I was going. I just needed to get out of the house, away from the reminders of Tracy, of everything that had happened. I couldn't stand to be in that space any longer, suffocated by memories of what we once had and what was now lost. I left without a plan, just a need to be somewhere else. The streets were quiet in the early morning, the city slowly waking up, but the world felt like a different place now. I wasn't the same man I had been before all this, before her betrayal had gutted me and left me grasping for something, anything to hold on to. I ended up at a diner a few blocks away, the kind of place I'd often passed by without a second thought. But today, it called to me, promising warmth and coffee strong enough to keep me grounded, if only for a little while. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee hitting me immediately. It was a simple comfort, and I needed that. Sliding into a booth by the window, I ordered a coffee and whatever the special was without much thought. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, didn't press for more, just nodded and left me to my thoughts. As I waited, I stared out the window, watching the city slowly come to life. People hurried by, going about their day, completely oblivious to the storm that had ripped through my life. It was strange, this feeling of disconnection from everything and everyone around me, like I was floating above it all, unable to touch or be touched by the world that continued to turn, indifferent to my pain. The coffee arrived first, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into my skin. The first sip was bitter, but it jolted me awake, dragging me back to the present, even if just barely. I needed to be awake, to stay alert. There was no room for slipping back into the abyss of my thoughts, not if I wanted to keep some semblance of control. The waitress returned with a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast, setting it down in front of me with a sympathetic smile. "Let me know if you need anything else, honey," she said, before moving on to the next table. I picked at the food, my appetite non-existent, but I forced myself to eat. I needed the fuel, needed to keep going, even though I had no idea where I was headed. Each bite felt like chewing sand, tasteless and heavy in my mouth, but I kept at it, swallowing the blandness down with sips of coffee. As I sat there, pushing the last few bites around on my plate, I couldn't help but think back to how Tracy and I used to have breakfast together on weekends. We'd sit at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, laughing about something trivial, just enjoying each other's company. Those mornings had felt so ordinary at the time, but now they seemed like a distant memory, a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. I shoved the plate away, suddenly sick to my stomach. The memories were too much, too raw, and I wasn't ready to face them yet. Not here, not now. I pulled out my phone, hoping for some distraction, something to pull me out of the pit I was sinking into. But when the screen lit up, the first thing I saw was a message from her. My heart skipped a beat, dread and anger swirling in my chest as I hesitated before opening it. Blake, I'm sorry. I just need some time to think. Please don't hate me. My hands shook as I read the words, and I had to fight the urge to hurl the phone across the diner. Don't hate her? That's what she was worried about? After everything she'd done, after tearing our life apart, she had the nerve to ask me not to hate her? I deleted the message without replying, the anger bubbling up again, hotter this time. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and threw some cash on the table, not even bothering to wait for the check. I needed to get out of there, to move, to do something before I lost control completely. Outside, the air was still crisp, the city now fully awake and bustling with life. But I barely noticed as I walked, my thoughts a chaotic mess, bouncing between anger, sadness, and a deep, gnawing emptiness that I couldn't seem to shake. I walked for hours, letting the city blur around me, my mind spinning. I wasn't sure where I was going or what I was looking for, but I kept moving, hoping that somehow, some way, the physical exertion would clear my head. But it didn't. The thoughts, the memories, the pain, they followed me wherever I went, clinging to me like a second skin. Eventually, I found myself in front of a gym, its neon sign flickering against the gray sky. Without thinking, I walked inside, the familiar smell of sweat and rubber hitting me like a wave. The sound of weights clanging and the hum of treadmills was like a lifeline, something solid to anchor myself to. I headed straight for the free weights, grabbing the heaviest dumbbells I could manage. The first lift was like fire in my muscles, the strain a welcome relief from the emotional pain. I pushed through it, rep after rep, my focus narrowing to just the burn in my arms, the strain in my shoulders. It hurt, but it was a pain I could control, something I could channel all my anger into. With each lift, I imagined his face, Stanley Cross, the man who had stolen my wife, who had taken everything from me. I imagined confronting him, the satisfaction of seeing fear in his eyes as I confronted him about the affair, as I made him pay for what he'd done. But no matter how hard I pushed myself, no matter how many weights I lifted or how many sets I did, the anger didn't dissipate. It just simmered, always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. By the time I was done, my muscles were screaming, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the emotional pain was still there, just as intense, just as raw. I slumped onto a bench, wiping the sweat from my face, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had no idea what to do next. Tracy's betrayal had shattered everything I thought I knew about my life, leaving me adrift, lost, and filled with a rage that I didn't know how to deal with. But one thing was clear. I couldn't stay like this. I couldn't let this anger consume me, couldn't let it turn me into someone I didn't recognize. I had to find a way to move forward, to reclaim some semblance of control over my life. And that started with dealing with him, Stanley Cross, the man who had thought he could just waltz into my life and take what was mine. The thought of confronting him filled me with a dark satisfaction, a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since all this started. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I had to face him. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about closure, about putting this chapter of my life to rest so I could move on, so I could start to rebuild. But first, I needed a plan. The idea of confronting Stanley Cross had planted itself firmly in my mind, like a thorn that wouldn't stop digging deeper with every passing hour. It gnawed at me, pulling at the frayed edges of my sanity until it was all I could think about. Confronting him wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my life, about getting some answers, some kind of closure that would allow me to move forward. But how could I do it? How could I face him without letting the rage take over, without losing control. I wasn't sure I could. Every time I imagined him, the cool, arrogant expression he wore like a second skin, the fury inside me surged, threatening to consume any rational thought I had left. I needed a plan, something that would keep me from crossing a line I couldn't come back from. I didn't want to end up like those guys you hear about on the news, the ones who snap and do something they can't undo. I had to be smarter than that. I had to be in control. After leaving the gym, I walked the streets for what felt like hours, the ache in my muscles a dull, constant reminder of how much I had pushed myself. But the physical pain was welcome. It kept me grounded, kept me from spiraling into the dark thoughts that had been haunting me since Tracy left. Eventually, I found myself in front of a building I hadn't visited in years, a small, unassuming office tucked away on a quiet street. The sign above the door was faded, the paint peeling, but the name was still legible: Carter and Associates. My uncle Jack Carter ran a private investigation firm out of this office, dealing mostly in insurance fraud cases, background checks, and the occasional cheating spouse. He was a retired Navy attorney, a man who had seen his fair share of combat and wasn't easily rattled. I knew if anyone could help me figure out a way to confront Stanley without losing my cool, it was him. I hadn't spoken to Jack in a long time. Life had a way of getting in the way, and we'd drifted apart after I got married. But now, standing outside his office, I felt a strange mix of guilt and desperation. I needed his help, and I had no one else to turn to. I pushed open the door, the bell jingling softly as I stepped inside. The office was small, cluttered with papers and files, the scent of old leather and coffee hanging in the air. A receptionist, a young woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, looked up from behind a desk, her eyes narrowing as she tried to place me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. "I'm here to see Jack Carter," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "Tell him it's his nephew, Blake." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and picked up the phone, speaking in a low voice before gesturing for me to take a seat. "He'll be out in a minute." I sat down on a worn leather chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, as I tried to calm the nerves that had started to bubble up. It wasn't long before the door at the back of the office opened, and my uncle stepped out. Jack Carter was a tall man, his hair a mix of gray and white, his frame still solid and imposing despite his age. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, his blue eyes sharp and calculating as they settled on me. But there was something else there too, concern, maybe even a touch of sadness. "Blake," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," I replied, standing up to shake his hand. "It has." He gave me a firm handshake, then gestured for me to follow him into his office. "Come on in. Let's talk." I followed him into the back room, where a large oak desk sat covered in papers and files, a few framed photos on the wall behind it, one of him in his Navy uniform, another of the two of us fishing when I was a kid. It was a small space, cozy in its clutter, and it brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. Jack sat down behind the desk, motioning for me to take a seat in the chair opposite him. He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in my disheveled appearance. "You look like hell," he said bluntly, leaning back in his chair. "What's going on, Blake?" I didn't know where to start. How do you tell someone that your entire life has been ripped apart, that the woman you loved had betrayed you in the worst possible way? But there was no point in holding back. Jack wasn't the kind of man who dealt in half-truths, so I told him everything. From the moment I discovered Tracy's affair with Stanley Cross, to the confrontation that led to her leaving, right up to the boiling anger that had driven me to his door. I laid it all out, every detail, every painful memory, until there was nothing left but the raw, aching truth. Jack listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though his eyes grew darker with each word. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a spot just over my shoulder as he processed everything I'd told him. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped together. "You want to confront this guy," he said, more a statement than a question. I nodded, my hands tightening into fists. "I need to. I can't move on until I do." Jack sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "And what exactly do you plan to do when you confront him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. I had to be honest with myself. What did I want? Did I want to beat the hell out of him? Did I want to scare him, make him feel the fear and humiliation I had felt? Or was I just looking for answers, some explanation that would make sense of the mess my life had become? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just need to face him. I need to see him, to make him understand what he's done." Jack nodded slowly, his expression softening just a fraction. "I get it, Blake. But you need to be careful. Guys like Cross, they're dangerous. They don't play by the rules, and they sure as hell don't care about who they hurt along the way." "I know," I said, my jaw tightening, "but I can't just let him get away with it." Jack was quiet for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, the wheels creaking under his weight. "All right, here's what we're going to do. If you're serious about confronting this guy, you need to do it smart. No rushing in there half-cocked. No letting your anger get the better of you." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. "I'll help you, Blake. But we need to do this right. We'll figure out where he's vulnerable, where we can confront him without things getting out of hand." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the tightness in my chest easing just a little. "Thank you, Jack. I appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet," he said, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We've got a lot of work to do." He started jotting down notes, his pen scratching across the paper with a steady rhythm. I watched him, a mix of hope and apprehension swirling inside me. This was it, the beginning of the end, the first step toward confronting the man who had destroyed my life. And whatever happened next, I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. Over the next few days, Jack and I worked out a plan. I spent every waking hour at his office, poring over files, records, and any piece of information we could dig up on Stanley Cross. Jack's office transformed into a war room of sorts, papers and maps spread out across his desk, photos pinned to a corkboard on the wall, and a large calendar marking potential dates when we might make our move. It was a meticulous process, one that required patience I wasn't sure I had. But Jack insisted on taking it slow, on gathering every bit of intel before we did anything. "This guy's got connections," he reminded me more than once, his voice heavy with caution. "We can't just walk up to him and expect to get what we want. We need leverage, something to keep him from screwing us over." We started with the basics: his schedule, his known hangouts, and the people he kept close. Jack had a few contacts in law enforcement and the legal world who owed him favors, and they provided us with some useful insights. We learned that Stanley was a creature of habit, his routine predictable to the point of monotony. He spent his mornings at the gym, his afternoons at the firm, and his evenings either entertaining clients or indulging in more private affairs that included my wife. Each new piece of information felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place, building a clearer picture of the man who had upended my life. But the more I learned about Stanley, the more my anger grew. It was becoming harder to keep my emotions in check, harder to focus on the plan without letting my rage take over. One afternoon, as we were going over the final details, Jack looked up from the papers spread across his desk, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "You're not just planning to talk to this guy, are you?" I tensed, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I don't know what I'm planning," I admitted, my voice tight. "I just know that I need to see him, to make him understand what he's done." Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "I get that, Blake. But you need to be careful. If you go in there looking for a fight, you might get more than you bargained for. I stared down at the papers, my mind racing. I knew he was right. Stanley was dangerous, not just because of his connections, but because of the power he wielded. He was the kind of man who would crush anyone who got in his way without a second thought. But knowing that didn't make the anger go away. It didn't make the need for justice, for closure, any less intense. "I'll keep it together," I said, more to convince myself than Jack. "I just need to do this." Jack didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "All right. We've got a good plan in place. Stick to it, and we might just get through this without things going sideways." The plan was simple on the surface. We'd catch Stanley during one of his regular morning workouts at a private gym he frequented. It was an exclusive place, the kind where high-powered executives and well-connected individuals went to blow off steam without the prying eyes of the public. But Jack had managed to get us in, leveraging an old favor with the gym's manager. We'd wait until Stanley was in the middle of his routine, when he'd be alone, tired, and less likely to think clearly. I'd approach him, confront him about the affair, and try to get some answers. Jack would be nearby, keeping an eye on things, ready to step in if it looked like Stanley might try something. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best we could come up with under the circumstances. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would give me the closure I needed. The night before we were set to confront Stanley, I found myself back at the guest room in my house, unable to sleep. The house was suffocatingly quiet, every creak and groan of the old wood reminding me that I was alone. Tracy hadn't contacted me since that last message, and part of me was relieved. I wasn't ready to hear her voice, to deal with whatever excuses she might offer, but another part of me couldn't stop wondering where she was, what she was thinking, if she even cared that she had destroyed our life together. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind churning with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. What if Stanley refused to talk? What if he turned the tables on me, using his connections to make sure I ended up on the losing side of this confrontation? What if, in the heat of the moment, I couldn't control my anger and did something that would ruin my life even further? The thought of losing control terrified me more than anything. I'd always prided myself on being calm, rational, the kind of man who didn't let emotions get the better of him. But this betrayal, this anger, it was pushing me to the edge of something dark, something I wasn't sure I could pull back from. I finally drifted off into a restless sleep, my dreams filled with images of Tracy and Stanley, their faces blurring together in a nightmarish haze. I woke up just before dawn, my heart pounding, sweat soaking through the sheets. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light through the curtains, and I knew there was no going back to sleep. I got up, showered, and dressed in silence, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like a physical force. I forced down a cup of coffee and a piece of toast, though I could barely taste either. My stomach was in knots, my nerves on edge, but I pushed it all down, focusing on the plan, on the task ahead. By the time I arrived at Jack's office, he was already there, waiting for me with a grim expression. He handed me a small earpiece, a way for us to stay in contact during the confrontation. "You ready?" he asked, his tone serious. I nodded, slipping the earpiece in and adjusting it until it was comfortable. "As ready as I'll ever be." Jack studied me for a moment, then clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Remember, Blake, stick to the plan. Don't let him get under your skin. You're in control here, not him." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they only added to the pressure building inside me. Still, I nodded again, forcing myself to focus. "Let's do this." We drove to the gym in silence, the tension between us palpable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweating as I gripped the steering wheel. Jack sat beside me, his face set in a determined expression, his eyes scanning the streets as we got closer to our destination. When we arrived, we parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping our heads down to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. The gym was a sleek, modern building, all glass and steel, with tinted windows that offered no glimpse of what was happening inside. Jack led the way, flashing a membership card at the front desk that allowed us access to the private workout area. The receptionist barely glanced at us as we passed by, too engrossed in whatever was on her computer screen. The private gym area was sparsely populated, just a few early risers working through their routines. It was quiet, the only sounds the soft clinking of weights and the hum of treadmills. My eyes scanned the room, my heart skipping a beat when I spotted him. Stanley Cross was at the far end of the gym, doing bench presses with a heavy barbell. He was alone, no one else in the immediate vicinity, his focus entirely on his workout. He looked different than I remembered, older, more tired, with lines etched deep into his face. But the arrogance, the smugness that had always radiated from him was still there, like a poison in the air. I felt the anger rising again, a surge of heat that made my vision blur for a moment, but I took a deep breath, forcing it down, reminding myself of the plan. I couldn't lose control, not now, not when I was this close.